Hi, everyone. It's good to connect with you all again. I hope you're keeping well and keeping safe. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Vicki Lawson, Professor Lawson, who is a professor in geography and directs our University of Washington Honors Program. She also co-leads something called the Relational Poverty Network with her colleague, Sarah Elwood. They're doing really important work in the network, bringing scholars and activists together to think seriously about inequality and poverty in America and really around the world. It's really important work. I hope you get a chance to connect with it. Dr. Lawson, I'm going to name her title because her title is doing important work here. It's Reimagining Social Care and Racial Justice. That's the title of the talk that she's going to provide for you. The notion of care does a lot of work for her. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's an ethic, and it's doing a lot of work here as we think about poverty in America, as we think about inequality, as we think about racism in America. So listen to the kinds of concepts that she's bringing to bear. I have some questions for you that go directly to her title. One is, how can we infuse care into our politics, into our policies, into our organizations, into our education, into our lives? How can we infuse care into our day-to-day lives and into our organizations and into our politics? How do we infuse care? So think about the notion of care as she's using this, and think about how we can infuse this into our day-to-day work and our day-to-day lives. The second question I have for you, what are ways we can counter toxic narratives? So she uses this term, toxic narratives. These are our narratives and beliefs that we have that simply are not true, but they do horrible things for people. For example, a toxic narrative may be that poor people are just lazy. They just choose not to work, that poor people are lazy. That would be an example of a toxic narrative. So my second question is, how do we counter toxic narratives? What can you do personally? What can we do publicly to counter toxic narratives? That's a term that she's using here, and it's a really important term. I hope you enjoy and appreciate the lecture, and I hope you keep well in the coming days and the coming weeks. Take care, everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vicki Lawson, Professor of Geography and Director of the UW Honors Program. I use she, her pronouns. I came to the UW in 1986 when Ronald Reagan was still president. Been here a while. I teach and do research on inequality and poverty and racial justice across the Americas. I've worked in South America and the US, and specifically in the American Northwest and in Seattle. My lecture today is called Reimagining Social Care and Racial Justice. I want to start by saying that 2020 has been intense, as I know you know. COVID has laid bare inequality in US society, and whereas white professionals like me are relatively safe, even as we moan about our online lives, all of my needs, for instance, have been met. I have a warm home and plenty to eat, healthcare and a paycheck. I can do my job from home, however imperfectly, and forgive me for the boo-boos in this lecture. But all around, there are and have always been many communities for whom this is not true. People who experience deep impoverishment, people experiencing housing insecurity and hunger, unemployment or dangerous working conditions, people living with no health care, or experiencing violence delivered by the state. These experiences operate in communities and for people largely Black and brown, or people living with disabilities, or in the LGBTQIA community. We live in a highly unequal society, one in which all too often property and property rights are more important than people. As Cornel West, who's professor of philosophy at Harvard, tells us, our response to the 2020 pandemic, the unemployment that has resulted, as well as the climate crisis in the US, reveal time and again that property and property rights appear to be more important than people. And he argues we need nonviolent democratic power sharing to change this state of affairs. While very difficult, 2020 has also been inspiring. While certainly COVID lays bare the lack of care in our society, and I'm going to talk about this, You might also say this year has been transformational. In 2020, social movements have the answers. They fight for housing rights and an end to evictions. They fight for universal basic income and for universal access to healthcare. They fought for decarceration and for mutual aid for communities. And interestingly, all of these ideas have been adopted, however briefly, by government to address the pain of 2020. I'd love to talk to you about, when you look at 2020, which powerful, vocal, visible social movements come to mind. Here are a few that come to mind for me. Black Lives Matter, the Anti-Eviction Project, the Housing Justice Project in Seattle, Real Change News, and ShareWheel, an organization of and for people living on the streets. These activists and so many more have brought us into powerful coalitions, offering answers to the moment. Social movements offer us the opportunity to think deeply about inequality. They offer us a chance to redefine how we care for each other, not through charity, not even through the market, or restrictive government special programs that ration care, but rather through a different idea, that of mutual aid. Mutual aid is a collective support in times of crisis and need. Communities care for and provide for each other by sharing resources of food, homes, or income. Mutual aid as a model is built on relations of trust rather than on transactions. Mutual aid works on horizontal relationships of care and the provision of needs to each other, not charity. I know this sounds idealistic, but it is. But it's also happening all around us. Communities across our region have built food pantries, they've built community gardens, they've built hygiene stations in the city and tent cities. The work is community-based, anti-racist, and built in bonds of solidarity and cooperation, treating everyone with dignity and respect. It is an epistemology of care. It is a practice of care. I imagine many of you have witnessed and perhaps participated in the protests sweeping our country that have been organized around economic and racial justice. I'm inspired by the numbers of people who are showing up in 2020 as allies and accomplices, putting anti-racist work at the center of a public conversation about COVID and inequality, rather than the low bar of just not being racist. The most important stories of 2020 are about people joining together to fight for housing or drinkable water, for health and for living wage work, and for reforms of policing and criminal justice. Ruthie Gilmore, an abolitionist scholar, reminds us that fights to change in the unequal conditions of life are actually the tangible ways to fight racism and inequality. Solidarity is built through care, through fighting for care to be available to everyone. My work as a teacher and a researcher involves asking questions about the root causes of racialized inequality and poverty in the US. I ask why we tolerate such high levels of inequality. How does this come to be acceptable? And finally, and most importantly, how do we change this state of affairs? The next part of my lecture is going to talk about root causes of inequality and poverty. But first, a quick word about why we seem to tolerate high levels of inequality. I argue that we do it by misrecognizing people experiencing poverty. We tolerate inequality by telling ourselves stories that justify our privileged lives and blame those in poverty for their own situation. If you search Google Images for people experiencing poverty, we think of the poor as homeless, as people living outside. But actually, the majority of people that experience poverty are housed, working, elderly, or disabled. And that should tell you something, or at least ask you to pose questions. Secondly, the narratives that circulate around poor people often point to inner cities, point to communities of color. And they include narratives that circulate, like the idea of the welfare mother. If you search on this keyword on Google Images, you will see this and many similar images portraying a Black woman seeming to have so many children. I wish we could discuss your reactions to this image in real time. But I'll tell you, for me, the welfare mother image racializes and demeans mothers in poverty through its imageries. And you should know that over half of the people in poverty are white, and all of them have complex stories. This misrecognition of homeless, the poor are just the homeless or only people of color, circulate about people experiencing poverty. And they lead us to think of them as failed, as threatening, as dangerous, as drug users, and more. I want you to think about the ways in which we often judge and demean the people who experience poverty, and think about whose interests are actually served by these misplaced narratives. So why does US society so often attach stigma, fear, and judgment to those who are poor, rather than responding with care and mutual aid? Part of what is so powerful about 2020 for me and about COVID is that all of the inequalities I'm referring to have been laid bare. But also, we all feel vulnerable. And this makes inequality much harder to ignore. So in this lecture, I will ask you to think about what it would take for US society to respond to poverty differently and collectively with a desire to change unjust systems. So how has 2020 shaped my work as a researcher and a teacher? I'm interested in how we might understand the root causes of poverty in the US. Now, of course, this is a big question. I'm going to focus on the structure of our economy to provide a partial answer. And to set you some context, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. The US is as unequal now as at any time in its history. 25% of jobs won't keep a family of 4 out of poverty. If we compare the US to Europe, we find that if you look at the blue lines on this graph, 50% of people in Europe hold a much larger share of national income than the same proportion of people in the United States. Turning to the red lines, you find that the wealthiest 50% in Europe have a smaller share of national income than those in the US. The punchline of this graph is that the US is more unequal than all other North Atlantic nations. So how unequal is the US? Well, we live in a new Gilded Age. In 1915, the richest 1% of Americans held 18% of the nation's income. That was the era of the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and the Carnegies, and their wealth prompted a debate about how the US could avoid becoming a European-style aristocracy. Today, the richest 1% have 24% of national income, or as Paul Krugman puts it, mansions have made a comeback. Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor and professor at UC Berkeley, says that income inequality is the defining issue in the United States, calculating that 95% of economic gains went to the top 1% since the 2009 Great Recession. Modern recessions intensify inequality. You could say that US society largely ignores these very high levels of poverty and inequality, but inequality is an uncomfortable subject for Americans. And the question is why? The answer, I would argue, is that our economic system has inequality built into it. At least 10% of US society has been deeply impoverished since we began collecting data over 60 years ago in 1959. In 2018, 38 million Americans are in poverty, And after COVID, this rate will probably increase. 38 million Americans are on food stamps or SNAP, and 28 million Americans have no health insurance today. 6 million of them have lost their employer-sponsored health insurance since February, and that's almost as many people as the population of Washington state. In short, poverty and inequality are persistent and structural features of our economy. They are baked into our system. More importantly, poverty is disproportionately experienced by Black and Indigenous and people of color, and also poverty is disproportionately experienced by women and people with disabilities. The 2020 recession will likely lead us to more inequality because we live in an economy that routinely suffers waves of recession, which we've come to accept as normal and inevitable. In 2020, the response to COVID has hastened the next US recession, revealing once again that our society and economy leaves particular people behind. COVID didn't create inequality, but each time around, and this is important, each time around, recessions intensify racialized inequality and poverty that persists long after the recession itself. The COVID shutdown brought massive increases in unemployment. The Urban Institute reports unemployment was 3.5% in February, increasing to 19% in April, and that it will still be above 10% at the end of 2020. This is a huge number. Economists start panicking if unemployment ticks above 4%. Unemployment deepens impoverishment, and it lays its burdens at the feet of the most vulnerable. If we look at job losses in recent recessions and go back a decade to the last largest recession since the Great Depression, the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 led to fears of a jobless recovery. 3 years out, as you can see in this graph on the green line, job losses remained deep, and some parts of the economy never gained back lost jobs. Those lost jobs were living wage jobs, those that the middle class held, working class jobs. They were replaced with either high-skilled or part-time work and low-skilled work that won't keep families out of poverty. We lost the middle of the job market. If we look at job losses under the coronavirus pandemic, in 2020, unemployment rose higher in the 3 months of the COVID than it did during the Great Recession of 2009. COVID and the economic downturn it created has swelled the ranks of the unemployed by more than 14 million people, from 6 million in February to 20 million in May of 2020. As you see in this graph, weekly claims for unemployment were still 1 million new claims a week through to September. Recessions are baked into our system. Recessions lead to job losses and increases in vulnerable work. If we look at coronavirus job losses by race, who's most affected? Black and Latinx workers are hardest hit by job losses. COVID exposes the ongoing vulnerability of millions of people. So we live in an economy that has cycles of recession. These recessions expand low-wage work. So then the question is, who does low-wage work in the US? Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately in poverty-level jobs. Workers of color are more likely to be working in poverty-level jobs, jobs where a full-time, year-round worker is paid below the poverty level. The graph shows the percentage of workers in each of these racialized groups who earned poverty-level wages between 1985 and 2017. White workers are the least likely to be earning at the poverty level. Latinx and Black workers are most likely to earn poverty-level wages. So this means they must depend for food, stamps, or other income supports to survive and to provide for their families. A new study in Washington state finds that women, and particularly women of color, hold 2/3 of our low-pay, high-hazard jobs, exposing them to economic distress and health risks. These are jobs like nurse, fast food worker, home care aide, and cashier, among many others. These are jobs deemed essential under COVID, but not rewarded nor protected. So poverty is persistent, gendered, and racialized, even for people who have a job. Persistent poverty and inequality are conditions of possibility for our society and economy. They define it. So how does persistent racialized poverty come to be acceptable? I would argue there are three key pieces to this. One, we sustain as a culture toxic narratives about people who are experiencing poverty. Two, we misrecognize the reasons for their impoverishment. And three, we ignore how wealth is distributed unequally in the US. So our society operates on a paradox. Between the governing claim of universal equality, we can all be upwardly socially mobile, and a material reality of persistent poverty and growing inequality, as I've laid out here. So how do we resolve the tension between the myth and the reality? We do it by constructing hierarchies of social difference, named by Michelle Alexander and Isabel Wilkerson as the American caste system. Caste means an artificial hierarchy that ranks people based on their relationships to the dominant caste. In the US, race determines one's position in the hierarchy. It's an infrastructure of power that was historically created and that we in 2020 inherit. It is an infrastructure that secures and hoards power for the high caste, and it's organized through our system of law and order, criminal justice, and our economy and work, as well as through access to land and through rationing access to our social safety net. Within this caste, people in need are misrecognized. As a result, the social safety net is rationed on the basis of judgments about who is deserving, who is flawed and undeserving. I return you to my earlier point about how we as a culture understand who is poor and why. So, airline workers deserve a bailout. Poor people don't deserve health care. What's interesting to me about our COVID moment is that it might break some of these logics by looking at these contradictions through our shared vulnerability. As I mentioned to you earlier, at local levels, there are progressive and caring responses happening all around us. Anti-eviction policies to keep people in their homes. Universal basic income, checks were mailed to everyone. Extended unemployment protections, recognizing that it's not people's fault they don't have work, as well as many more. Can these moves be modeled for a more caring politics? Can they be rehearsals for living differently together? So 2020 lays bare inequality and impoverishment. Indigenous scholar Nick Estes argues that we live in a society that exhibits a politics of carelessness. But this is also a time when social movements are offering up creative responses to crisis. They offer us a politics of care. COVID stay-at-home orders shine a bright light on how many people are housing insecure in our country. COVID demands creative solutions to long-term ongoing problems, and social movements lead the way. In my work, I learn from and amplify the creativity of social movements who are building forms of survival and thriving. Social movements respond with mutual aid as a caring response to persistent poverty and inequality. In my work, I learn from and amplify the creativity of social movements through my collaborations with my colleague, Sarah Elwood. We organize the Relational Poverty Network, which is a collection of over 300 scholars and activists who are challenging normalized ideas about quote unquote flawed poor people and are pushing for more critical analysis and answers. We do public education work, such as producing podcasts that you see here. We most recently developed a series titled Reimagining a Black Sense of Place Under Siege, COVID and the Police State, These podcasts feature Black artists, activists, and scholars discussing Black freedom work. We also collaborate with Real Change News to educate students about the root causes of homelessness and racial injustice. Real Change provides low barrier work to vendors who sell the street newspaper for their survival. Real Change also provides sanitation services, a food pantry, and incomes to unsheltered folk. Real Change also takes action for social justice. In winter of 2020, my students mounted an exhibit of the Real Change Portrait Project. The exhibit features portraits of Real Change vendors. You can see some of them here. Many of the vendors live on the streets, and along with their portrait were stories of their lives, of their families, the degrees they have earned, the jobs they have held, the wars they have fought in, among many things. The Portrait Project humanizes people, who are routinely demonized. It is also a project that educates people about the beauty, the joy, and the complex life of Real Change vendors, as well as stories about the economy or the health crisis that left them in poverty. We mounted the exhibit in the Allen Library, and hundreds of people viewed it and were moved by the portraits. I also work to amplify mutual aid activism like Tent City 3, which will again be hosted on the UW campus in winter of 2021. In my winter quarter class, students will learn from Tent City residents about structural poverty and about enacting mutual aid and solidarity. I talked at the beginning of this lecture about mutual aid as a model of solidarity activism. Tent City is an example of mutual aid between residents and the communities who host them. The pandemic makes undeniable what social movements have always known: the intimate connections between health and housing, between housing and life. The COVID crisis makes clear that home is more than capital and property. It actually provides for the survival of people. This realization is simple, but it can change the terms of political debate to be centered on mutual care. The work of social movements offers us all a political opening for a different imagination around property and housing, around eviction, around shelter provision, around a politics of care. All of this raises a fundamental question for me that was raised to me by the feminist geographer Doreen Massey. What is an economy for? What could it be for? An economy could be organized to provide care. I argue today that care is both a language and an ontology for politics. A politics of care can challenge the US caste hierarchy. We could learn that inequality is a condition of possibility for our system as it is currently configured. Healing and racial repair begin with us all being curious about poverty and inequality, and by being accountable for our own learning and our actions. I invite you students to understand poverty and inequality by being students of your own history. Please ask yourselves, how has poverty been normalized in our society? Why do we assume that poverty is inevitable, or that poor people are flawed, or that healthcare, housing, and enough food are only personal responsibilities rather than forms of social accountability? Understanding must precede action, so I invite you to learn more about the structural causes of racialized inequality. Become curious about inequality and be accountable for what you learn. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Vicki Lawson, Professor of Geography and Director of the Honors Program. You'll have her bio. So I really want to ask you a set of questions, Dr. Lawson. And the first question that is a question that I've asked a number of your colleagues, that I've asked Bob Stacey most recently, and Megan Ming Francis recently, and Alexis Harris. And it doesn't have to do with your lecture, but it has more to do with how you became a geographer, how you made your way to Ohio State. So let's go back to the young pre-Dr. Vicki Lawson and talk about yourself in high school and how you got to a university setting and how you got to the United States and Ohio State and discovered the work of poverty.
Well, thanks for having this conversation, Ed, Doctor. It's a pleasure to be with you and with the students today. So I always tell this as a story of serendipity. There was no grand plan. I grew up in a family that was in England, and so there was a very huge emphasis on class and class mobility, upward class mobility. But both of my parents were working class. My dad started his life selling brushes out of a suitcase door to door, and both my parents were in the Salvation Army. And so I say that to tell you that their aspiration for their kids was that we be middle class, that was their dream. And so part and parcel of being middle class is going to college. So from a very young age, it was an assumption for me that I would be going to college. I never really thought much about it. It wasn't something I reflected on. It wasn't even something I aspired to. It was just normalized in my family. So my mother was a teacher and she taught, and so that was something that I definitely wasn't going to do because I wasn't going to follow in their footsteps. So it was going to be me. And when I was in high school, in England, you study 3 subjects in depth called advanced level A levels. And one of those 3 was geography. And I found it to be crushingly boring. We documented how many imports and exports every country had and how many people lived there. And it was this sort of categorical, encyclopedic view of the world. And I definitely wasn't ever going to study that again. But I went off to college, and I was lucky enough to be in one of the few college programs that looks a little bit like an American university in that we were able to study instead of one subject, which is the typical British model. When you apply to college, you're going to go read English or read math. I went to a college, Leicester University in the Midlands, where you could study social sciences, which is 5 subjects. And as I went through the first year, we studied sociology and anthropology and economics, and geography was one of the 5. And somewhere in that first year, I was introduced to this incredible professor who changed my whole career. And he was a critic of colonialism in Africa, as it happens, and he radicalized me. And he showed me a different way to think about the world, and he was a geographer. And so I ended up reading geography. Serendipity was just a chance encounter in my education. Coming to the end of my college years, what I really wanted to do was go to Africa and be involved in the work of transformation post-colonialism. I guess I carried a lot of white British guilt and sort of thought I could go change the world. But it turned out that having a degree in geography wasn't a sufficient amount of qualification to actually go do something constructive. And thank goodness the organization knew that, because I certainly didn't. You needed to have a tactical skill, be an electrician or a bricklayer or somebody that could do something. And so when that pathway didn't really pan out, I was in the Department of Geography at Leicester University, pondering my future, really unsure, but really wanting to get out of England, to be truthful. And there was a letter tacked up on the notice board, and it was from Kevin Cox at Ohio State University, encouraging undergrads to apply for graduate school. All right, that's an interesting idea. So I applied to all of 2 graduate schools. One was UBC in British Columbia, and the other was Ohio State. And Ohio State came through with the money. And I'm not going to lie to you, I got on a plane. This is how ready I was to leave England. I got on a plane, and it was only when I got to New York City and spent a night there before I flew on to Ohio, watching the news in the evening on the weather map, was when I learned where Ohio was. I mean, this is literally what I was. So there was no grand aspiration. There was no imagination of myself as a graduate student, much less a professor. It was literally one foot in front of the other, reacting to my life. But when I got to Ohio State, I started to work with a professor, Larry Brown, who worked in Latin America. and worked on poverty and migration. And that's really where the fire got lit again, but now focused on Latin America instead of Africa.
I hear a number of themes and lessons that run through this. One is be open to discovery and to search and keep moving ahead. The other is to be brave. In this case, you made a very brave move to go to Ohio and you didn't even know where it was. And be open to having your fire lit. And you also, it sounds like, let's lay the groundwork for your work. You were influenced by multiple disciplines. You were able to see across disciplines. So then you found that the discovery of, or the work of poverty and geography in the intersection of those fields. You made your way to the University of Washington, and you've had an extensive career here at the University of Washington. And I want to bring up something that I know that you wouldn't bring up, which is you've won a number of teaching awards for the university itself, of our Distinguished Teaching Award. You won departmental awards as well. You've been recognized throughout your career for both your teaching and mentoring throughout your career. What is that about? Because you seem to have a philosophy of teaching that guides you and that has guided you throughout your career.
Yeah, teaching's what makes this job worth doing, right? The research is exciting, being an administrator is challenging, but the work is the students. And I feel, though, from day one, I've been a very humble teacher because I learn more than I feel that I give. I create spaces to allow students to learn from each other. And so my commitments are to really opening space to recognize that there is no expert in the room. And that comes from my feminist formation, this idea of decentering the idea of the all-knowing expert who can read the world through one lens and make, shine light into every corner. I mean, it's simply not that way. These days, a large part of my pedagogy is really committed to students becoming humble learners in community. So we do a lot of collaborations and community engagements. And I will never forget the last time Tent City 3 was on campus, which was in 2017, at the end of a course that worked with residents to a certain extent, my students wanted to have a party for the residents. This is in the winter quarter. And so in Mary Gates Hall, we had a room and the students had food and we had music. And I remember the students had the wisdom to not make it an interrogation of the residents, but a celebration of life and of being in community. And I will never forget at the end of our little party where we played music and we sang and we ate and we played games. The students were sitting around, all honors students, all relatively secure in their futures because they were going to have an honors degree from the University of Washington. And they sat there looking so anxious about their future. Some of them were graduating that year and anxious about where that would take them. And two of the residents sat with them and reassured them that they were going to be okay and that they had the skills. And then it was this beautiful reversal where it was people who live without formal shelter, who have lived incredibly complicated lives, but challenging lives nonetheless, sitting there reassuring these kids who were going to go on to grad school and law school and who knows what, that they were going to be okay in the world. And that sums it up right there.
And so you create a space where there's mutual learning. I'm going to come back to Tent City 3 because that is happening now on our campus. And I want, for those that don't understand Tent City 3, I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to come to the title of your talk because it speaks to the kind of pedagogy or the kind of teaching, because there's power in your title. The title of your talk is Reimagining Social Care and Racial Justice. So reimagining social care. Tell us why you chose that title and what's in that title, because there's a lot there.
Yes, that title so one of the things that happens, I think, for many of us when we talk about 2020 is sort of we've all gone through a lot of disruption of one kind or another. And so there's a tendency to tell this sort of depressing narrative of how hard this year has been and perhaps even be a little precious about how hard it's been for us. And this is intended to be an invitation to be optimistic. It's intended to be an invitation to notice all of the hard work that's always already going on around us, to actually do the work of social care, even as, and we just went through an election that really didn't foreground care at all. But that's not unique to the 2020 election. That is a feature of politics in this country, where the questions of poverty, impoverishment, and care are the last ones on the list, if they're mentioned at all. So the invitation is to understand that for society to be better, and for society to be inclusive, and for society to ever be anti-racist in any way, is going to start with centering care. And by care, I mean not just concerned, but I mean the work of ensuring that everybody is cared for. And you can read that. I mean, I work a lot on shelter. You can certainly read it through the idea of there being housing accessible, really, really accessible. And we know that markets can't deliver that to everybody in a place like Seattle. It could mean ensuring that healthcare is in fact a human right, as it is in all of the other advanced economies. The idea of universal healthcare is only radical in the US, right? Or to think about the criminal justice system, which has been so much in the forefront of activism this year, is to recognize that care starts from understanding that most people don't need a punitive response. They have a need that needs to be responded to, right? And not that people are needy, but that, as a society, we have a responsibility to understand what people's needs really are and how we might deliver them. And I always talk about this idea that we have a politics that is centered on the economy. So we talk about markets, and we talk about efficiency, and we talk about supporting corporations, and we talk about Wall Street. And so we have a language of politics that worries about the health of the economy. I understand that. I understand why that's the case. But we could have a language of politics that centers care. And if we did that, we would, let me just finish one thought. So there's a wonderful scholar by the name of Ruthie Gilmore, who I mentioned briefly in my lecture, who talks about, if you want to do anti-racist work, if you want to think about racial justice, start from healthy provision of water. Start from making sure people are not hungry. The work of anti-racism is the work of care.
Mm-hmm. So what's remarkable about what you just did from the title itself, you took us through this interdisciplinary treatise of starting with almost an ethic or a philosophy of care, and move your way through talking about the legal system, policy making, how communities are organized, very much cutting across the grain again. So that's so powerful in your work. There's something that you said early on. You quoted Cornel West at the front end of your talk. And that quote was Cornel West, the scholar: "Property and property rights seem more important than people." What did Cornel West, and what do you mean by that?
Well, I can't speak for Cornel West. He's someone I admire so much, but I can tell you that this is something I'm thinking a lot about in my work. There was a quote, the street newspaper, Real Change News, is a place of really interesting journalism, and it's a quality piece of newsmaking. And many years ago, 20 years ago, one of the headlines in Real Change News was "The poor are not citizens." The poor are not citizens. And it's haunted me ever since. And I've been really moved by scholars like Ananya Roy at the UCLA Luskin School, scholars like Ruthie Gilmore, scholars like Chandan Reddy, and many others who talk about the idea of propertied personhood. That is, to hold property in the United States is to be a full person. To hold property like a home is to have rights to privacy that people living on the streets do not have. To have property like a home is to have rights to tax breaks on your mortgage, which people living on the streets do not have. So that there are, or to have what I even think of citizenship as a form of property, to be a person who is seen as a person who has the right to have rights, is a person who has property, ironically, because property proves that they are respectable, right? We've created this sort of really interesting inversion where rather than being a person is enough to be respected, one has to be a person who has been responsible with property, or you are a person who deserves to have your property held safe. So if somebody were to invade my home and burgle my home, that would be a crime. that when the city sweeps tent city encampments off the streets, that is not a crime. That is cleaning up the streets. So that where one's situated has been mapped onto respectability, often through property. Does that get at the idea enough?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's something else that you're implying here, Dr. Lawson. You come early on in your talk also to a statement, and it's an optimistic statement. I'll say a hopeful statement, maybe not optimistic. Cornel West makes the distinction between hope and optimism. Yours is a hopeful statement. That social movements have the answer to address the pains of 2020. What are some of the social movements? You talk about them in your talk, but what are some of the social movements that stand up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody in 2020 can think about social movements without thinking about Black Lives Matter, which has been this incredible moment of raising up of voices that have long been active. This is not the discovery of something in 2020, certainly, but the sort of coalitional response to Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd, who again is emblematic of a much longer story of premature deaths for Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. So at the top of the list, I have to mention Black Lives Matter. But for my own work particular, and I would say, that what Black Lives Matter does is bring together activists from across the spectrum. And it reminds me actually of the WTO protests in Seattle back, I don't know, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, time gets away, where, we had turtles holding hands with housing activists, holding hands with women in Black, that this isn't, that so in 2020, there's been this coming together and again of the connections between the work that is protecting the planet, the work that is resisting impoverishment, the work that is protecting, becoming anti-racist, right? So there's all of that. But for me, more particularly, thinking through the lens of housing, I work with and I'm inspired by the sort of resilient, seemingly never-ending work of the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance, of the Housing Justice Project, of Real Change News, of Facing Homelessness, all of whom have been working for decades to raise awareness, to change public policy in pro of people that live in unstable shelter or have no shelter at all. So when I think about social movements having the answers, I think about the sort of ongoing work that they do to lift up and foreground the voices of people who have had the experience of having an unsafe shelter, right? Who are the ones we must learn from rather than the ones we must villainize. And I think about their multiple forms of advocacy. So they march on city council meetings and they testify in city council meetings. They support, tiny villages or like Licton Springs, which is a no barrier tiny village that anybody can go into for shelter to begin a road to recovery if needed. I think about the tent city movement. So all of these social movements have the answers in that not only do they work with the political system and with the policy infrastructure, but they also always do the immediate work of providing for need, and they do the work of changing our awareness more broadly, which must happen if social change is to really take hold.
I participated in some of these marches and gatherings in downtown Seattle, and I experienced much of what you described, of people coming together, of people sharing hand sanitizers, of people wearing masks, of people walking together, really walking together in solidarity. And I've seen groups across races, across communities. And yet there are moments when if I turn on the television or look at the news, I see the very same marches described very differently. I see images of looting. I see police cars turned upside down. I see burning. And sometimes I don't understand the juxtaposition. What work is going on there, Dr. Lawson? Is that intentional? What? And so, because that spreads around the state, and when people are voting, it becomes part of the narrative around the politics of our community, which is, are you for lawlessness? Yeah. Or are you for something else? And so how is this happening, and what work is that doing?
That's such an important question. I mean, all right, 2 things. Yeah, one is lawlessness in the sense of destroying property or being violent is not something that I am particularly, I'm not comfortable with it and not supportive of it. But I can't remember, I believe it was in Minnesota, shortly after the death of George Floyd. There was an incredible analysis by a young Black woman on the streets who was deeply angered, deeply frustrated by the violence that had been perpetrated against her community. And I can't repeat her analysis, and I wish that I could just give you a citation of it, but it was about, people are looting Target. And her analysis was utterly eloquent about the looting of the Black community and about histories of stolen labor and stolen land and about the frustration and the depth of anguish that many feel. And I don't want to seem to be speaking for her, but that to me, it was incredibly moving. So I think on the one hand, there is sort of gratuitous violence on the part of some who harness these protests for whatever their own ends are. There's that. There's also the really deep anguish, pain, and suffering that so many in our society don't know about because they haven't done the historical work of learning about it. And there's also all of the peaceful alliance building, coming together in solidarity, that doesn't get covered. And so there's also this piece around whether it be the sensationalism of the media and then a cynical politics of harnessing that to a particular agenda, which is namely to be reelected, right? I mean, the law and order argument is not new. It wasn't a 2020 phenomenon. That is a historical phenomenon. And it's rooted for me in something that I work on, which is the villainization, the blaming of communities for their own suffering. And the reason, in my view, that happens is to displace from any attention to the construction of privilege and the inequality of opportunity, the inequality of justice that we have in this country. So it's rooted in something much deeper than the way the press covers the protest. It's rooted in our own cultural narratives around why people are poor. Well, the narrative goes because they're flawed or because they're not trying hard enough or because they're drug addicts. So, this sort of facile, easy way to turn the narrative onto blaming the victim, as opposed to looking, as I try to in my lecture, at the root causes of inequality that are much, much deeper. And I don't do them justice, but I invite people to become curious about them.
And you use the word easy because it is intellectually easy to do that kind of harm. You posed a set of questions in your talk, and our students in the audience will get a sense to work through them with you. But they're such powerful questions, I'll read them back to you because it speaks to, again, your teaching, because you're asking the students, you're asking the community to hold these questions. You said the core questions are, what are root causes of racialized poverty and inequality? Why do we tolerate high levels of inequity in the United States? How does this become acceptable? How do we change this state of affairs? They're such powerful, powerful questions, and you address them through. But it seems to me you're also asking us all to carry those questions and engage in inquiry all the time, to make that part of our methodology, that we're asking those kinds of questions, how things came to be.
Thank you for highlighting that. I mean, that is exactly the point. I mean, my lecture doesn't even scratch the surface of answering those questions. Really, it's just an invitation to think about them because most fundamentally in the United States, even more than in Britain, because, in Britain, it's not a country, I'm not particularly an Anglophile, but in Britain, we are class obsessed, which means that we are focusing on inequality in a perverse kind of way. In the United States, there's a very striking narrative about equality of opportunity and everybody can succeed and everyone can be upwardly socially mobile. And there's a deep, deep discomfort with talking about how unequal this country is. And that's what I try to point out is that actually the United States is almost as unequal as the most unequal countries in the world. Take Brazil, take India. We're more on a par with those countries in terms of inequality than we are with West Europe or Japan and so to start with actually looking hard at who we are and then saying, boy, there's a real disconnect between the way we think about ourselves as a culture and the ways in which the empirics show up, the realities of what is. And so until we're willing to look at that, we won't even begin to pose the questions that I'm asking, right?
You laid out three pieces that I found so powerful, and I found kind of personally powerful, and I want to thank you for this description. The question was, how does racialized and gender inequality become acceptable? And you said there were three pieces. One, toxic narratives that are sustained about people, misrecognizing reasons for impoverishment, and ignoring how wealth is unequally distributed in the United States. And it took me back to my own childhood, living in a community where many families in my community, African-American mothers raising their kids, really, really decent folks. And my mother worked really, really hard and worked every day, worked really hard. We worked hard in school, but we needed the benefit of food stamps. We needed the benefit of welfare from time to time to actually enable her to go on and do work and raise our family and just sort of be in the middle, and which is what we needed, which is just to work hard at this. But yet there was a narrative of welfare mothers and an image of welfare mothers, and even stereotypes about welfare mothers that were driving big cars, that were at home being soft. And it was such a powerful thing to do. It didn't resemble the mothers that I knew. It didn't resemble the families that I knew, but it seemed so harsh. It seems so careless, and if anything, it seems so downright political and kind of mean.
Yep.
But it was a method. It seemed to be a methodology, but I'm not sure what purpose it was serving. But you capture it with these toxic narratives. It puts words to what that was.
So there's a wonderful book written a couple of decades ago by Sanford Schramm called After Welfare, and he breaks down the relationship between the narrative of the welfare mother, which is a narrative, it's a myth, it is a construction that arose during the Reagan years. And it arose in a political campaign, quite specifically in a political campaign that was, there was a woman, I believe in the South Side of Chicago, who was found to run a scam on the welfare system. And it blew up into an utter absurdity through its use as a political tool. And and so she was driving a Cadillac and she was eating caviar every night. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And if you know anything about how welfare benefits are, you know, they're usually somewhere around $200 a week in the United States on average. So that it was a ridiculous construction. But what it was harnessed to was the effort by Reagan and those Republicans that followed him, most particularly Newt Gingrich in the 90s with the Contract on America, as I call it, which was an agenda for reducing social spending. It was an uncaring politics that was about reducing the size of the social safety net. And so finding that narrative about this Black woman who was typically represented, and I want to be sure you understand I'm telling a myth, represented as having many, many children, of being overweight, of being lazy, of gaming the system. She became, much like Willie Horton became the argument for law and order, right? And the funding of a punitive state. The welfare mother became the argument for unraveling social safety nets. And so she not only served a purpose in the Reagan presidency, but she served it long after, all through the 90s. And it was actually Bill Clinton, because poverty is not a partisan issue. It served politics on both sides of the aisle in the United States. Bill Clinton was the one who signed into law welfare reform, which was an unbelievably punitive attack on the safety net and on policing and on immigration, and had set the stage now for the sort of ongoing unraveling of those protections in our society. So those narratives, in my view, they serve the purpose of making privileged people feel more comfortable, for sure, generally, but they also serve the purpose of a particular kind of agenda that unravels the safety net.
Yeah, more comfortable and more righteous at times, which is not helpful to health policy debates in the United States. Let's turn to something again that I know you believe is hopeful, because you've had a hand in your career of bringing 10th City and now 10th City 3 to the University of Washington campus. And I believe I know your beliefs about this. You know it's not the answer, but you find something hopeful in Tent City 3. And for those who may not know what Tent City 3, describe what's hopeful in that model and what we might see on campus if you come to the Seattle campus and see Tent City 3 at work.
Yeah, so it's really great that for the second time now, the UW is going to host Tent City. So tent cities have grown out of the shelter crisis in the city of Seattle. They've not only grown out of the inadequacy of shelter to meet the need and the growing need as the city becomes more and more unaffordable, more and more unequal, but they also grew out of the fact that for some people, and again, I'm be careful not to speak for people, but to say this is what I have learned from people who've been through the experience. The shelter system is a difficult place to be. For families, families are split. If they go into formal shelter, men go to one shelter, women go to another. For some people, it's impossible to keep children with families, with fathers in particular. For some people, it's impossible to keep animals with them that are their soul and their comfort in incredibly difficult times. So there's that, the sort of splitting of family units of one kind or another. In addition, there are a lot of rules in shelters. Shelters turn away people they deem to be, unruly, or people they deem to be not willing to play along. And to be clear, Tent City also has rules, so I'll come back to that. But so there's a capacity issue, there's a splitting of families issue. There's also the worry on the part of some people who are unsheltered that they're being surveilled and controlled through the collection of data about them that they then have no access to or control over. So there are a lot of reasons that some people would prefer not to be in formal shelters. Tent City, run by Sharewheel, which is an organization built by and for people living outside, runs shelters on its own terms. So you can come into Tent City. They have a set of people that protect the exterior so that it's a secure place. They have rules about mutual aid, which means that you take turns making meals. You are in community with the people in the shelter, but you also have privacy because you're inside your own little tent. And so it's a place that allows people to feel a sense of control and citizenship. It's a place that is about mutual aid, whether it's within the tent city itself or between the tent city and the community that hosts it. So it's a model of providing dignity, horizontality, agency, and security to people who are incredibly vulnerable at that moment in their lives.
It's a beautiful model. My final question to you, we have just a minute, and as we speak, we are both at home. I know that you're at home. The virus, it seems to be, is spreading. It's getting worse. The governor just recently laid out more restrictions, and we do what we can to create spaces in our homes and in our lives that bring us joy. And every now and then you would move to your right or left. So move slightly to your right, and we see what look like ribbons behind you. Tell us what brings you joy. Tell us about the ribbons behind you.
Yeah. Well, so I'm incredibly fortunate. I live on a little farm out in East King County, and obviously humans bring me joy, but then so do animals. And I raise mules and train them. There are 5 critters on the property. 1 is a horse, 4 are mules. And I have learned they're beautiful animals. They're intelligent animals. They take me out into the woods and allow me to go to church. The Japanese have this word. I don't know the word in Japanese. It's called wood bathing. I do a lot of wood bathing, where we go in the mountains. We go out into nature and just commune. And that brings me a lot of peace and a lot of pleasure. But in addition to that, the relationship with the mule is a very fascinating one. They mirror back to me whatever energy I'm putting into the world. And it's extremely humbling when I go out and I'm, and they tell me, no, change your game. And then because they're a 1,000-pound animal, the only way that we're going to be able to work together is through mutuality and through shared understanding. And so there's a subtlety and a grace and a beauty to working with them. So my joy is training mules and riding mules. And it brings me a lot of peace. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do that.
So we end on a note of subtlety, grace, and care and trust. Dr. Lawson, you gave a beautiful lecture. Thank you. And more importantly, thank you for the years of teaching and service to our community, to our campus community, to our external community, and for providing us hope.
It's a pleasure.